Yeah, it's really fantastic. Thanks for having me out today. It's great to see this group. Really interesting conversations going on. Really appreciated what kind of Leighton brought to the table. I don't have nearly as big a story about myself or how I came into the business. And now I'm just trying to find, there we are. So here's kind of our outline. I'll start with a bit of an intro, talk a bit about acquisition versus leasehold interest, and then kind of around location, legal and zoning, commercial lease terms. There's a lot of detail here, so I'm happy to share this afterwards as well. And feel free during the slides to ask questions. If we get sidetracked, we'll park the questions, but we'll go from there. And apologize, if I look red, it's because I got massively sunburned 2 days ago. Okay?
Don't
I'm like
worry.
doing this, I'm like still burning. I was under an umbrella, but it had micro perforations and it got me like on one angle. It's really quite funny. It's like a stripe. Anyway, it's also on my face. So Marcus, there's a much bigger team than this at Marcus Millichap. In fact, Isaiah is one of the research group members. They're here and is the reason I'm here. This is Mark Patterson's our broker of record. I joined the team back in October of last year, and I've been in the business about 12 years. I'm a broker as well as a senior associate. And this is some of our support group, but there's 50 people involved in the Toronto office, and there's 85 offices around North America. So we're a large commercial brokerage. Hello. There we go. As you can see by this very complex chart, right? We've got a lot going on. We do everything from multi-housing, single tenant net lease, retail, office, over 100 billion in sales volume. So there's really experienced people from all walks of, kind of all asset classes at our offices, including hospitality. It's my background. I've done dozens of small businesses, including coffee shops. I had coffee shops listed during the pandemic. I saw that Found Coffee on College Street come up during the pandemic as well. And I'm always watching what's happening in the market. We have lots of retail. These are just some examples of the trades, but the list goes on and on. A lot are not as interesting as this. They're just smaller deals, and but some are larger. And so my experience really is in kind of retail, hospitality, understanding coffee shops, restaurants, and hotels. So really the first key question, I think, as you're looking at what's your strategy on location, on your business, is are you in this to run and build a business, right? Or is there also a real estate play? And so that's why I say buy versus lease option. So it really depends on your strategy, right? If you look at Tim Hortons, they do what McDonald's does. They buy the building, they lease it to the franchisee. When they sell the building, they put it in the contract, there cannot be a coffee shop there. So they are literally trying to lock up locations, and then if it doesn't work out, they might open nearby, but they don't want anybody else there. So their whole piece is the business is going to pay for the real estate, they become landowners, eventually they hive off the whole real estate portfolio, it becomes worth a lot of money, especially if you're able to mortgage it. Leasing is really about getting in for the least amount of capital and being focused. So there's obviously a lot of risk in buying if you're not sure if the coffee shop's going to be successful, because suddenly you're on the hook for this building and you have no cash flow. Right, so it does take deep pockets to do it. So you can see I've got Tim Hortons, Starbucks is focused on leasing. Right, so the other piece around commercial real estate, it's not like a house, right? If you're buying a building or a location, you're going to be in for 35 to 50% of the cost of the building. So it's a lot more expensive. So you'll see there's a lot of investors putting a lot of capital to do this. So they generally want some really assured, brand they know is going to kick it off and be successful. So this last point kind of reinforces what I said earlier. I don't know if this brings up any questions.
That's good.
Right, so obviously leasing provides for flexibility. The business doesn't work out, you sell off the businesses, assign the lease to somebody else, they can take it over. You're stuck if you bought it, right? You're in a whole other situation, it's a lot less liquidity, you can end up in a real cash problem. So the other way to enter into a lease, which Leighton talked about, was buying a business. So essentially, you buy the assets of the business, you don't have to buy the brand or anything else. Say somebody had a coffee shop, cafe, could have even been a nail salon, for God's sakes, right? And you can buy the assets of that business, part of which are essentially the lease, right? It's the biggest asset. If it has a liquor license, that's a huge asset they can sell as well. And the other piece is there's a huge time savings on buying an existing location, right? So if you go in to a raw space, it's never been used for food or a coffee shop, you have to get permission from the city. And so going through that process can bring up a whole number of things. If you're You look at a lot of locations in Toronto, they're all extremely narrow, right? Small footprint, 1,000 square feet. Well, if you go in there, say you want a coffee shop that also serves cocktails in the afternoon and you want a liquor license, now you're gonna have to install a 200 square foot bathroom with an adult-sized change table, right? If there was already a business in there with a liquor license, you will not be required to do that. It's all grandfathered, it all goes in. So that'll save you months of time and obviously huge amounts of money. Right. I think the other piece before I get into this around the money, and I'll get into a bit later talking about the tenant fit out in a space. So if you are taking over a space, and this is, I think, the number one error new entrants into any kind of restaurant or coffee shop business get into, they go in, they find a space, they say, oh, we're gonna need $100,000, $500,000 to fit this out and make it perfect, right? Then they go through and 6 months later, 9 months later, like this business isn't working, maybe the partners aren't working out anymore, maybe they just made a mistake with the location, they decided it was a bad idea, anything can happen. Right? Well, your fit out, you might have spent $100,000 on it, is not worth $100,000. It's worth whatever the market will bear. It might be 20 grand, right? So your actual coffee machine might be your biggest asset in the space. But assuming that the business is worth what you spent to create it is the biggest error. It's never true, right? You can go spend $1 million creating a restaurant and you could be lucky if you get 200 grand out of it, depending on what's inside, where it is, what the terms of the lease are, and all those things. So obviously location, this is about the real estate side. I'll cover some of this and then get into the rest. Obviously location is everything. I thought what's interesting about Found Coffee is those two spots, the one on College and the one on Shaw are really good locations for a couple of reasons. Right? Just the high visibility, right? The one on College Street, yes, there's a Tim's nearby and there's another place nearby, but it's kind of the only coffee shop on that block really you can get to, and there's really busy condo traffic coming out across the street, people coming from Kensington. It's just in a good spot for pedestrians, right? It's got that foot traffic. It's not too far away from anything. Obviously the location itself is the marketing, right? It's like people can't see you, they're just not gonna come in. If there's stairs going up, you're gonna cut your foot traffic in half. So anything that creates a barrier to getting in there, or a barrier to waiting for your coffee, like there's too many people in the shop, you can't even get in there, you can't order it, there's no shortcut on your app or something to do that. Like, complete lack of convenience is gonna create problems, you're just not gonna see the people come in. And so I thought the other thing about Found Coffee that was really insightful is like, he didn't compromise, right? He didn't say, oh, I couldn't get this space on Shaw, therefore I'm gonna go just get whatever space nearby. I'm gonna wait until I find the right place, with the right money, the right visibility, right? There's a big, basically used to be an old school that is work lofts, they're like business lofts across the street from that location on Shaw Street. So it's got a lot of people coming and going in the neighborhood in that space. So obviously brand perception too. Who's this for? Is this a cool spot to come and hang out? Is this a convenience spot? Is it a drive-through? Is all volume? Like, what is your customer? So the location kind of really has to appeal to that customer. Is it a commuter coffee shop, neighborhood hangout, spot for university students? What do you got? It all kind of form and function and brand really need to fit together, and compromising is generally always a mistake.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
So your first point in the previous slide, you mentioned that you might be putting in $1 million to start up a new coffee shop location, or another hospitality business, and you may end up selling for $200,000 at the end of the day if you're not planning it right. Are there a couple of things that you think would be worth really paying attention to that can really make an impact on increasing the valuation at the end of the life of the business?
Right.
Things that you can pay attention to upfront. You mentioned location. Is there anything else that really stands out to you that can help ensure your...
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one is if you just assume, whatever you spent on the fit out and the furniture and the equipment, you're gonna get 10 to 20 cents on the dollar. Just assume 80% of that value is gone. So you know that whatever you invest in that, don't expect it to be something you can get back later, right? Once it's used, maybe the coffee machine might be the only one that retains more value, right? So certain things will, but on average it's 10 to 20 cents on the dollar, depends how old it is. A 5-year-old fridge, it's really not worth that much, right? So that's the one piece, but what you can do is like assets, like the lease is the biggest asset, so a favorable lease on good terms. If the landlord tries to put in, like say it's a landlord that's considering redeveloping the property and gets you to sign a lease that has like a 6-year cancellation provision called the demolition clause. If you do that, that just destroys the value of the business, right? Because right there, you know, somebody can buy it, but then they can be out in 6 months' notice, right? So the value isn't that just that term, having 5 years plus renewals, like the business can sustain itself for a certain period of time. Because even if you're selling like a successful coffee shop sale, we sell at this great location, profit's 150 grand a year, fantastic. So we can generally sell a business for 2 to 3 times the profit, right? The earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation. So let's say that business is worth $300,000 to $400,000, great business. Stick in the demo clause, it's worth nothing. Because now somebody can't guarantee they're gonna make that $150,000 for 5 years or more. So they can't pay you that much money if they have no guarantee of earning it over time, even though the guarantee is also their own performance.
Thank you.
So this was more on location. I think I spoke a bit about this already. Really about customer accessibility is key. You know, obviously you need high volumes. And my next slide, I think I cover this a bit more, right? Like there's a low average transaction. So it's like you know, coming down to numbers, like obviously the passion, the caring for the customers, those are great messages and that needs to be there. Ultimately, how much your average sale and how many people you can get through the door is what's going to make you successful, right? Regardless of your kind of brand positioning. And I believe, here, did I put it? I'm going to go straight to that just to show you. So here's kind of an example, right, of how to think about your location costs. So GROC, known as gross occupancy costs, are everything it costs you for the space, the lease, the base rent, TMI, which is taxes, maintenance, and insurance. Obviously, this deposit is slightly different. This is kind of the absolute maximum you should be able to budget for your location. 12 is even high. I mean, the best operators, their total cost for the location is in the single digits, right? They can be 6 to 8% if they're really good. Coffee obviously has good margins, but your volume is so low. People are spending $5 to $10. You know, the number of people who have to get through, right? Just say it costs you $7,000 for location, everything, insurance included, right? The whole thing. Well, I mean, you're looking at a $5 transaction. You know, you're 11,800 transactions per month, right? So peak times, people obviously, coffee is kind of, they have coffee at certain times of day, right? It's either the morning, early afternoon. You know, you have very low volumes at night. You know, it really depends. Say you have 4 hours of peak volumes, right? That's 1.5 sales per minute. Yeah,
So
to get through during peak periods.
do you have any numbers on what the average number of transactions per day are for independent coffee shops? Like they're doing.
Yeah, it's a lot of that's privately owned, so it's very difficult to get those numbers. There's some average transactions tend to be $5 to $10
for the independent.
For most places, right?
Right. Okay.
Right. Even you look at Tim's. I mean, the prices are fairly affordable, put it that way, right? And so they can see that mostly you get out of there for less than $10. But I mean, they're able to handle lineups of 100 people, right? Most of these stores are well positioned, so you'll see they'll put through several hundred people in the morning. And so that's really how they get there. And competition. So clustering can be beneficial. It really depends on how many people might be going to a certain area, right? You'll notice that for several years, and if you kind of watch the coffee shop scene in the city of Toronto, there's Aroma coffee shops, opened several really close to Starbucks. Eventually the Starbucks exited because of their change in strategy, but that actually boosted their brand. It didn't necessarily hurt Starbucks for a long time, right? Until situations changed. Like there was I think it's the corner of Lippincott and Bloor, right by Bloor and Bathurst. You know, there's an Aroma, a Second Cup, and a Starbucks on 3 corners.
Yeah.
Right? And that can really work if there's enough people coming in. A lot of people coming out of the subway, walking by. There's just enough going on there. So you can cluster, but if the other demographics aren't in place, it's not going to work.
Is there any rule that, for example, if you want to open up Starbucks, it shouldn't be within a certain kilometer of Tim Hortons or other coffee shops? Is there any certain rules for that, or they can just put it beside each other?
I don't think there's any rules. I mean, it's all about competition and what the landlord and what everybody's willing to do. I mean, once it comes to competitors like that. I think it really does come down to what are your who's your target audience there, and is there enough of them in that spot to support both of those brands? I mean, obviously, in some cases, some of the larger brands are doing it just to kill off the other brand or to maintain some market share in that way, right? To compete, so they'll obviously create a money-losing store at times just to make sure they don't get completely eaten up in a neighborhood. But there's no real kind of hard and fast rules. It's a lot of analysis, looking at foot traffic, what are the volumes. Like, it could be great, there could be great vehicle traffic, but nowhere to stop. So it's a terrible place to put. If there's nowhere to stop and there's not a lot of foot traffic, even though there's high traffic through the area, it can be a terrible place to put a coffee shop unless you have somewhere people can pull in or a drive-through. Legal and zoning considerations. So zoning for commercial use is typically required. Some neighborhoods might have it, available. It's all within the zoning bylaws in the city of Toronto if you're not familiar with them. It's extremely important when you're dealing with space you're putting in a coffee shop that you don't go into it without confirming that the zoning, the use is permitted. You don't have to go through a lengthy application process, because you could be sitting there for 6 months trying to get it approved. Right? So that really can put a damper on your opening, right? If there already was a coffee shop or a restaurant, you're already kind of able to access that. And that, even though it's not directly an asset of the business, it really functions as one. So some zones in the city of Toronto, residential, employment, or industrial, you can put coffee shops, but you have to watch out for special restrictions. Like one restriction, for example, on Ossington, you can't have a restaurant or coffee shop bigger than 2,500 square feet. So it can only be a certain size. So I watched one of the big players in the city try to go in, buy an extremely large building, 10,000 square feet, get it rezoned and approved for a 400-person restaurant. The entire neighborhood came out. First of all, it was already restricted. Then the entire neighborhood came out, kiboshed the whole thing, and now they're sitting on a building that's worth $7-8 million. They can't use it. So their plans went sideways really hard, right? Really fast. In some cases, they thought they can get away with it, but I mean, it's not a risk, especially as a new entrant, you ever want to take on. Right? Make sure you can get the approvals and whatnot. So, because if the property was never used as a coffee shop, you have to get a change of use application into the city and ask for that change of use, and that can take months. Then you have to provide floor plans, site plans, and know about fire suppression if it has a certain number of stories. Like, it goes on and on. Acquiring a business, right, will basically every shop has to have a business license. So you can't get the business license unless the use is approved. So that's really the barrier to operating without getting it approved. So you can go in and try to open, and then somebody shows up and says, do you have a business license? Well, obviously you're in trouble. You can get fined. So any offer to lease or purchase, right? This is a key thing about finding spaces. If you're gonna buy anything, you're gonna lease something, you've gotta put conditions in that deal. You'll see in residential, there's all these firm deals, firm offers. You can never do this in commercial real estate. The risk can be enormous. It can bankrupt you, right? Like, you have conditions. So I mean, this example I just gave you at Dundas and Ossington, right? Conditions would be, I think I wrote this up on the next slide. Well, basically conditions would be having your lawyers review it, your ability to get permission to use the space a certain way. I have more of this in the slide deck coming. Permission to use the space for a coffee shop, right? Ability to get insurance. Make sure you can get insurance for the building. Because you can go into it, well, look at this funky old building, it's great. The insurance looks at it and goes, oh, that's going to be $12,000 a year. Right? You're like, no, okay, not great anymore, right? Because they say there's problems with the buildings. How is it built? Does it still have old wiring in it? You just don't know.
Quick question. When you're doing a commercial purchase transaction of, let's say, an existing business, let's say you're buying an existing coffee shop,
yeah,
and you may still want to do the kind of legal due diligence that you are mentioning there.
Yeah, you definitely
What is
have to.
Generally the stipulation that you would put in the offer when it comes to the timeline that you want to allow yourself for legal review and zoning investigation to ensure that you are going to be able to proceed with it?
Mm-hmm. It's always a delicate subject, because obviously the seller wants you to have a shorter timeline as possible. They don't want you to tie up their business for sale for 2 months and then you don't actually buy it. Like, that's their biggest risk, because then they kind of miss the window. Maybe they don't want to operate it anymore. Maybe they can't. Right? So generally it will be like 2 weeks to 4 weeks, depending. right, on what you're able to do and how complex it is.
Thank you.
Some may be very easy to confirm, but you might do things like put in provisions so you get all documents from the seller within 3 business days, right? And then once you receive the documents, you've received everything, give yourself 2 weeks or 3 weeks, like 10 to 15 business days to go through due diligence and confirm everything, talk to an insurer, talk to the city,
Thank you.
etc. So before I get into kind of more key terms and kind of flood your brain with lots of acronyms, were there any questions? Okay. So does anybody know gross lease versus net lease? What I'm talking about there? Probably the lawyer, but it's okay.
Well, the gross lease would basically include the TMI, right? Like it would maximize
it's
the
a total
opportunity
amount.
for the landlord, but it wraps all the expenses into what the tenant is paying.
Exactly, right? So yeah, it's exactly, that's your final number plus HST to rent the space. You still have to pay for your own utilities and things like insurance and whatnot, but that would be the total charge from the landlord. The net lease really separates the 2 items. So this is your net amount, plus the landlord's gonna charge you for taxes, maintenance, and insurance, plus HST that they have to document and send you. So, but maintenance can be them making phone calls just for somebody to come shovel the sidewalk, right? So it can be, it's everything involved. If they have a property manager, it's obviously that. So everything that goes into it, and then their building insurance. So the insurance in a net lease, the building insurance part of TMI is not your business insurance, it's the building insurance, right? And then you have to get separate insurance for your use. So net or basic rent is what it's also referred to in the net lease scenario. TMI I already explained. Then there's always HST on rent and TMI. And the TMI actually does not 100% always HST on TMI. It depends how it's calculated. So if they boil it into one figure, then the HST will be added. If they just send you the bill for taxes and insurance and a couple maintenance items, it isn't all boiled together. So it depends what how it's set out. But they're responsible for giving you documentation of that at every year. A couple of things here, the tenant incentive or allowance. So if you're going into a new lease, you can ask for, and especially now in this kind of market condition, and depending where it is, an incentive or allowance from the landlord. So say, oh, look at this space looks fantastic, but has no plumbing, has no heating system. The heating system's broken, it's done. It needs a few repairs, right? And there's, say there's an inadequate, we inspected it, and the ceiling doesn't have a proper fire separation from the apartment above. You say, okay, landlord, I'm willing to lease the space, but I'd like you to take care of these items. And so they'll buy the HVAC, machines, they'll buy everything, fit it out, and then you come in and actually finish the space up for yourself. So in some cases, like that can be $10, $15 a square foot. I've seen it up at $30 a square foot. It really depends who's leasing, what the term is, and what the terms of the deal are, and whatnot. The other thing you can ask for is a fixturing period or a free rent period. So fixturing is a period where you essentially would pay no rent and even no TMI and get to renovate the space and get ready to be open for business. And the landlord might say, yes, okay, I'll give you 6 months, but if you open earlier, you start paying rent when you open, as soon as you're open. In some cases, they'll let you have it. It really depends. Fixturing versus free rent. Usually the fixturing includes a discount with zero money for TMI, whereas a free rent period would just be free of basic rent. So that's often how it's referred to. Things, everybody's a little bit different, but that's often how it's done. The other piece is obviously term and renewals. Like I mentioned, the lease is your biggest asset for that coffee shop. If you have to unload it at the end, you want to sell it, or say you're selling all the businesses together, you've created a chain of 6 and you want to sell them. Well, having a decent term on it, like a 5-year term, plus having an option to renew, allows you to stay in the space. As soon as you run out of options to renew, the landlord can just kick you out. You don't have any kind of rights to stay in the space. But if you do a 5-year lease with 2 5-year renewals, at the end of the 5 years, you can decide to leave, you just give them notice, or you can renew it, but you have to negotiate the rent, and what it's going to be for the following 5 years. In some cases, businesses will exit because they can't get an agreement with the landlord. Even they go to arbitration, the rent's too high, market rates have gone up too much. When they leased 10 years ago, it was really inexpensive. Now, everything's much, much higher. And in some cases, it can be totally under the control of the landlord. It's the taxes, right? Taxes, commercial taxes have tripled in 10 years. So a space that might have a basic rent of $4,000 or $5,000 on Queen Street could also have a TMI of $5,000. Right? So it's actually 10 grand for a tiny little space, and half of that can be taxes. So it can be quite high. Landlord's work versus tenant work. Before I talked about tenant allowance or incentive, right? The landlord's fitting out the space. It's obvious it's landlord's work. Tenant's work is your own. What you're doing to the space, right? It can be separate, it can be infrastructure. Default provisions and remedies are things you want to watch out for, right? So what happens if you don't pay rent? What can you triple the rent? You can put anything in there. You've got to review this in detail. And obviously, I'll talk about the need for a lawyer later, right? But knowing what's in the default provisions is extremely important because you could land yourself in trouble, right? There's people who will, you know, like everywhere in the world, there's always sharks. You could sign the lease and be in default the lease immediately if you didn't read it properly, right? You don't know what's in there. And if you're in default in the lease, suddenly you can owe them all kinds of money. Like you have to watch in detail what's in those documents and what you're agreeing to. It's not all that straightforward. And also if you're buying a business and there's an existing lease, what is in there is extremely important. You may not want to proceed because of what's in the lease, right? Because of how much risk you're taking. Assignment of lease is a big one. So provision to exit the lease through the sale of the business. In all cases, a landlord will approve an assignment of the lease. But you know, if there's no assignment of the lease, obviously you can't do anything with it. You can't sell the business. You can't even buy it, right? You're essentially in a situation where it's immovable. It's only with that tenant and that's it. And then this is a big one. There's been many legal cases now around this, and you know, there's lots of arguments around this, especially in 2021 and 2022. There's a force majeure clause. It's really about, you know, I'll leave it to lawyers to explain this one, but it's really about what happens in the case of fire, war, pandemic. What happens if you can't open business because of a government mandated shutdown? Who's paying the rent? Am I paying the rent? Is the landlord paying? What's happening to my lease? How's that going to work? So there's been a multitude of cases. I think the most recent one, I'm probably not the best person to speak to it, probably you are, but they essentially, the court decided that during the pandemic, they couldn't operate the business for 6 months. They still were responsible for paying rent, but were not going to be considered in default, and the landlord had to extend the lease by 6 months. Right, so I think I've got that right, but like, so that's where it kind of landed. At first, you know, there was all kinds of blockages on evicting tenants. Then there were people taking advantage of that during the pandemic. Anyway, having this clause well written and understanding what's in it is crucial in case things go sideways. Got a lot of detail for you. Okay. Offer to lease versus lease agreement. So an offer to lease is essentially completed with a broker like me, has all the key business terms. It's like all the stuff you're kind of basically agreeing to. A lease agreement's a bigger legal document, and you do it with a lawyer. So often what the offer to lease will do will set up a provision where say, okay, we're agreeing on the base terms, we know what the rent is, how much, you know, how long we're here for, all those things. And then we also agree to go do a lease agreement right after this offer to lease is completed, where lawyers will negotiate all the terms. And the terms of what's in there, aside from the base business terms, which will not change, all need to be worked out in there. So that, you know, there could be a force majeure clause in the offer lease, but then there could be editing to that clause later if the offer allows for it. Right? So this is where you get your legal advice. So this allows you to essentially figure out if you're going to tie up the space or not before spending money on legal fees. Right? So you want to do that when you know you have a result. You don't want to be negotiating offer after offer. You want offer on 5 spaces with a lawyer, and then you spent all that money, you still don't have space. Conditional versus firm deal, I talked about this before. Conditional deal allows you to exit before committing to the contract, and that would always protect yourself. One of the key things I put into every single deal I write up is that, you know, not only it could be like confirming use with the city, but having your lawyer read the document and approve the terms. Right, that is the #1 thing. That allows you a lot of flexibility around exiting. If you got into a contract and the lawyer reviews it and say, hey, wait a minute, right, these default provisions or this thing aren't going to work for you. You don't want this, right? Or the demolition clause was hidden somewhere in the document. I didn't see it, right, at first. Your broker didn't see it, but it's in there and it's going to kill the value of your business. You should get out. So essentially helping you get out of a bad deal is extremely important when you do these things. Okay, well, here we go. So obviously purchasing is way more complex. You know, lender requirements are higher. Interest rates are obviously extremely high right now, and the due diligence, you need due diligence to protect yourself from catastrophic losses, right? So the biggest risk of these days with, especially in the city of Toronto, it could be anywhere, it could be any old building, is right here, this environmental site assessments. So insurers, lenders will not lend you money without knowing there's an environmental site assessment. And this can be, like, essentially what they're looking for is potential contamination of the property. So it can be like, essentially, if you buy the building and then you find out later there was contamination, you can be ordered to clean up the building, right? Depends on what you're using it for and everything else. It can cost you millions of dollars, you can lose everything. So putting this into the mix is extremely important for any purchase as well. Essentially, more conditions to allow you to do due diligence and make sure you've got a good purchase on your hands. Right, so where are things at? So before, were there any more questions? I know I've got you through a lot of detail, so.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Any questions so far?
So where's the market at, right? This is the big question, because it really depends, like, you're looking at retail properties, right, here that we're talking about. And there's kind of, I would say honestly, there's two markets in every market. There's a market for people who own properties or leasing properties who have no leverage, like they have no debt, they're in a great position. And then there's the market of people who are leveraged and who have mortgages, and they have mortgages to pay now, and the rates are going up. And those are way different market circumstances right now. Somebody who has no leverage can sit in the building for years, right? So they bought it 10 years ago. Now their rents are actually like 40% of what they bought it for. They can sit in it empty for 2 years and wait to see what happens. Others, obviously, they're in a situation where they got to unload, so they'll be much more willing to make a deal with a tenant or anybody else, right? And this really comes to leasing especially. Right? You'll see landlords sit with this space vacant for 2-3 years, waiting for the right person. What's happening, like Queen Street downtown, things are totally in flux. Like, values haven't really dropped yet, but there's just a struggle to keep retail. Part of it is it's just so expensive, and foot traffic is down 50% in a lot of these areas, right? Queen Street, Queen West, West Queen West. Obviously, office to anything downtown in the financial district, the office buildings are 20% empty, some are 50% empty. Right? There's just no foot traffic, so it's playing havoc with the market. There's better deals available, but there's also more risk because you don't know what's happening with that market, especially if you start the Ontario line. If you try to put something downtown in the financial district, you can end up in a spot that's going to be half shut down for years, right? Even if you get a good deal. So there's lots of landlords willing to make changes, and to make deals, but there's a lot of risk involved as well. Suburban plazas, drive-through locations, they're all doing extremely well, right? Because it's very easy. One is people have moved out there. There's just more going on than there used to be, right? While foot traffic in downtown Toronto is down 50%, it's up 50% in smaller communities, Hamilton, Waterloo, all these places, Guelph even. And then malls have their own market. Obviously, they went through a huge struggle. Everything got shut down, but people are back in droves. They seem to be doing okay. But malls are obviously extremely expensive. So buildings, commercial condos, and mall units. I just wanted to point out there's the 3 different kinds of assets you can be looking at, whether you're leasing or buying. Obviously, there's one just picking up a building. It could be a building that's a standalone, just has 1 floor. It could be 2 stories with an apartment in it or anything else, right? That's often where they'll end up in Toronto. Those are pretty obvious. They're freehold buildings. Commercial condos, right? There's a lot of commercial condos available. So you can buy a space that could be 500 square feet, 400 square feet, 1,000 square feet in a building, right? You own it independently, you pay the condo fees. And the other is mall units. It's kind of similar to commercial condo, but it can be a kiosk, tiny little space. There's malls to watch out for, and there's malls that are working really well. So it really depends where, but I would be very cautious of mall units unless you know the foot traffic is really in there. So this, I'm going to save you from going to this too far into detail, but what's basically saying here is that asking rents have gone up, but vacancies have started to decline again, but things are pretty flat, right? Cap rates still remain around 4%, although that's probably changing as we speak with the job announcements today. I don't know if you saw the labor numbers. That's probably going to drive the Bank of Canada to either up rates or at least hold them for a long time. We're doing better than they hoped, which is kind of weird. But to buy, you can be buying from $400 a square foot to $1,000 or more, depending on what you're buying where. It really does vary by neighborhood, right? So I think this can provide some guidance. You can take a look at this later, but it's ultimately by pocket and by neighborhood. And I think the big thing, like Found Coffee, he's always, you notice he cares, right? But it's about the numbers are crucial. Without the number threshold being met, forget it. you're not gonna do the space. I think that covers everything.
All right. Well, we received a thorough introduction into commercial real estate, specifically around retail. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions for Mark?
Did you say you're gonna be able to share that? Or-
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll share it and I'll have all your contact.
What do you think is a really underrated neighborhood in Toronto?
I guess for what?
Just, I don't know, your personal opinion. It's
Underrated?
always supposed to be on social media, like a lot of like young people are always like, this is a really unknown spot, but it's like Kensington Market. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm just trying
Not
to
exactly underrated, right?
like
I
especially
think it
for,
really depends what product or service you're putting where, right? Like, I mean, it's really who's the demographic you're after. I mean, it's like underrated, you know, to somebody 25 can be totally overrated to somebody 45, right? And then who's your customer there? And what's your average bill size? Do they have money, right? Like you know, people love Liberty Village, but I've heard many a restaurateur complain that people don't have any money at Liberty Village, right? So you go in there, pay the high rent, and they're like, nobody can spend anything here. Like, this is the wrong place to put something high-end, right? Or have too many high-end restaurants. Like, there's only so many that'll support it. So it always completely depends what's that demographic, and so getting access to that information in detail is crucial.
now in Waterloo that information is made public through the city, like you get market reports that you can just access. In fact, the city just, like we literally had somebody come to our restaurant, cafe, even though we're not the owners, being like, do you want like the business report? Like here, like we can help you, and like well, give it to my boss. But
Right.
like, is that something that's made available by the city of Toronto, or is it a little bit harder to get? Is it something that like you need to find somebody to like give
I think
you?
all the information is
Okay.
available as well. It's all found through the Open Data Portal, or you can go directly and find reports, and then
Okay, perfect.
then you look too at the City of Toronto Police. They publish all the crime statistics and like very specific. You can map out where stuff's happening and kind of understand what's happening in the neighborhood. So it gives you a sense.
And then there's this company, Marcus Millichap. They also they produce reports and they're freely available. They come out on a quarterly basis and.
There we go. Let Isaiah speak to this.
I mean, this is what I do. I'm presenting on this in October about
Yeah.
like gathering research, doing market analysis, and like one of the challenges is that in Toronto there's a lot of data available, but people don't realize is that 40% of all Canada is in Toronto. So if you're in, you know, this neighborhood, it's way different than Mississauga. Mississauga is way different than in a neighborhood in Pickering, right? So what's happening is that there's a lot of challenges in the sense of getting data that's specific to your neighborhood that's going to be relevant, right? Like Liberty Village, what Mark talked about, it's really true, is that people think it's very wealthy because it's a desirable area to live. But historically, in terms of statistically, like it's actually not a very rich neighborhood. But because there's so much demand to go there, and this is something that Mark can speak to a lot, and this is so my job, just for those of you who don't know my name, to say, like I coordinate the research requests of him and the other 50 brokers in our company. And one of the challenges is that like some neighborhoods, like I think you said Ossington, there's a lot of power for the local community where they could sort of, they'll show up to the approval meetings and they will speak out. And then I live in Pickering, and you can show up in Pickering, and sometimes if something's happening by the water, people show up, other times nobody shows up, right? And that changes the dynamic of the marketplace in ways that numbers can't show. So that's why it's tough. I do market reports depending on what you're talking about. I sometimes do them like every quarter, sometimes I do them every month. We do them on a request basis, but you know, stats can't, if you want to get like to know what your neighborhood, like we have paid resources that are really expensive. I wouldn't recommend to people unless you're really rich. Like, you know, some of these things cost $20,000 a month, like it's ridiculous. You know, Stats Canada has almost everything you need to know in terms of like a local neighborhood's economy. Get really fluent with that. Feel free to call one of us. We'll teach you how to do it. When you're setting up a business, it's really important that you understand the local neighborhood, because otherwise, like I used to live at Jarvis and Dundas area, Jarvis and Gerrard area, and the coffee shop that he sold was close to that neighborhood. And there's another coffee shop that just opened up actually last year there, the same spot, similar spot. And I don't know how long they're gonna last because people can't afford $8 coffee down there. It is one of the highest homeless populations in Toronto. The household income's really low, and these sort of things would have been available if somebody just did the research, right? So If you guys are interested in setting up coffee shops, like, it's more than just coffee, unfortunately. Whether people want your coffee is another thing, not because of the taste, but because they might be able to afford even taste it, right? So, yeah, if you have more questions, like in terms of getting research, like come to the talk in October, and feel free to give me a call, and I'll share.
That guy's out for coffee.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you can also download the entire data set of licensed eateries in the city of Toronto. Map out, you could find the coffee shops and map them out, so you can see exactly where everything is.
That sounds like fun.
I was a geography person, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that one?
You can download the data set of all the licensed eateries in the city of Toronto. So everything, every
Like
restaurant,
apply it
coffee
on
shop,
ArcGIS.
store.
Right.
You can find out where all the coffee shops are and map it on your own Google map and do everything
Right.
along with it, right? So you go through your analysis.
Can you get like by date, so you can like see where the trajectory is, like you can do 20, 21, 22 kind of thing, or just current?
It's the current, it's the current data set.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much. This was very insightful.
Thank you.